What if beer was more than a recreational drink? What if it was made in every household? What if it was drank by everyone, including children? What if beer was about survival? That was the reality in 18th century America. Not every water source was safe to drink, and everyone kind of knew that. And so they would stay away from water when possible and drink other kinds of beverages. Coffee and tea, and especially something like hard cider. But beer was important because it was already sterilized. They didn't know exactly what was going on with beer and why it was safe to drink. We know today that if you boil all those ingredients, you're killing off things like dangerous bacteria. You introduce your yeast and you get this mildly alcoholic beverage. Now, they weren't sure about the science behind that at all. They had lots of different ideas about why the beer was safe to drink. They knew it was safe. They knew it was better than water, that it actually had health-giving properties, that it could make you strong. When we read in Benjamin Franklin's autobiography, he talks about workers. The workers, when they get ready for work, they drink beer, and at lunchtime, they drink beer. It's part of their wages. They know that this strong beer makes them strong. He disagrees with that. He drinks water instead, but they believe that it's a very, very healthy drink. Beer also plays an incredibly important role in the military. Both the land-based forces and the sailors at sea, they are given rations of beer, up to a gallon a day. And if they don't have beer to give these sailors or soldiers, they have to give them a substitute. Something like grog, which is watered down rum. They need something like that to get them through the day. Water isn't good enough for those soldiers. Beer was an alternative to water, which might be dangerous to drink, but there was also pressure from the other direction. There were hard liquors that were available at the time, something like gin that was really becoming popular in the early 18th century. That was a giant societal problem, especially in the United Kingdom. Because the gin was so cheap, it was being drank by everyone, children included. And so beer was a much, much better alternative. If the water is dangerous and we don't want them to drink gin, then let's have them drink beer. Now, their beer is different than our beer today. And there are lots of different kinds of beer in our time period. There is strong beer, there's common beer, there's table beer, there's small beer. Now, all these are probably a little weaker than our beers today. They had a much more difficult time extracting all the sugars out of their grains, and their yeasts weren't as, let's say, efficient as the yeast strains that we have today. So we can generally think that a strong beer, it might be 8% alcohol. And a standard beer is definitely going to be something like 3 or 4%. And table beers and small beers, which the children and women are more likely to drink, are maybe 0.5% or 1% in alcohol. In places like Great Britain and North America, beer is a working man's drink, and it's drank by everyone. That means the brewer is very, very important. And in many places, he's very highly regulated because this drink is so important to society. So beer can only have very particular ingredients. For example, the beer that we're talking about today, that we'll be making, was actually illegal in the early 18th century for brewers to make. It was very simple. It used molasses to create the beer, so it was very easy to make, very inexpensive. It became regulated or even banned in this setting, I think because it makes a kind of a substitute beer that's very inexpensive to make, and they could pass it off as something that had much better ingredients. Home brewing is incredibly popular in our time period. Just about any household can make a simple beer like this with very, very simple equipment. If you have a couple of large cooking vessels and a barrel or anything to keep your finished beer in, and then your ingredients, you need soft water, you need some kind of sugar, whether it's malted grains or something like molasses, maybe a few spices like ginger, and a little bit of yeast, and you're ready to start making beer. It's very interesting to delve into 18th century brewing, especially compared to modern brewing. We have a lot of home brewing that goes on these days, and brewing in the last 100 years, so much scientific research has gone into it. We know exactly what's happening with brewing. We understand all these different strains of yeast and the malting of grains and where all these flavors are coming from. They didn't have any of these ideas in 18th century brewing. And if you read so many of the recipes about brewing, you can't actually figure out why they work at all. They break all kinds of rules. Things like putting the yeast in when it's way too hot, or putting hot water on top of the yeast as it's working. Maybe they don't boil the things that they really need to boil, and so there's sanitation problems. There's all sorts of issues when you read an 18th century brewing recipe. And if you really want to make it work, especially the first time, you have to kind of break the recipe a little bit. You have to rearrange it and do some extra steps, because when they were writing it down, they didn't understand what was really going on. They didn't understand how clean everything needed to be. They didn't even really understand the true nature of yeast. So let's talk about this very, very simple beer that anyone could brew at home. It's called a molasses beer in our time period. And what's really interesting is there's almost exactly the same recipe that George Washington talks about. He writes about in the late 1750s. While he's a military officer at Fort Loudon, he writes down in his book a very simple molasses beer recipe. Well, in 1790, there's a molasses beer recipe. It says molasses beer according to the method said to be practiced in Philadelphia. Take 5 pounds of molasses, half a pint of yeast, a spoonful of powdered race ginger, and put these ingredients into your vessel. Pour on them 2 gallons of scalding hot, soft and clear water, shake them well till it ferments, and add 13 gallons of the same cold water to fill up the cask. Let the liquor ferment about 12 hours, then bottle it off with a raisin or 2 in each bottle. Now, if we followed this recipe exactly like it says, it would fail. Because, of course, they're mixing up this yeast and the ginger and the molasses, and then they pour hot water right on top of it. And of course, that would instantly kill your yeast, and then it wouldn't work anymore. And then the whole purpose, of course, of sanitizing everything with the scalding water, they break that rule by adding regular water after that. So we don't want to make our recipe exactly according to this. Now, this probably could work for them for 2 different reasons. One is that if they put their killed yeast into a vessel that already had some yeast in it, like say a barrel that already had beer in it, old yeast would actually be working and not the new yeast. And this new water that's introduced that would, in our sense, break our sanitation rule and possibly bring in bacterial contamination, well, it's likely that this beer did not last very long. It was drank right away. It was a green beer. It wasn't aged for a year or 6 months or anything like that, because by then it would have gone sour. So it was likely drank right away. I've shrunk this way down so that it will be easy for anyone. We can make this in a gallon or 2 batch, because nobody needs 15 gallons of molasses beer. So if we take 2 gallons of water and we bring it up to heat, and we can add about 1 pound or so of molasses to that. All we really need to do is bring it up to about 200 degrees for, let's say, 15 minutes. And that will be plenty to sterilize what's going on with our water and our molasses. Then we can add our race ginger, and that's just regular ginger. Race ginger just means like a ginger root. Then it has to cool off. That has to cool off to a temperature that doesn't kill off the yeast. And depending on what kind of brewer's yeast you have, that might be down to say 90 degrees and more likely even cooler. And we're just gonna put our yeast on top of here. If you have a standard powdered yeast, you can just pour that right on top. They've got their yeast from the brewer, so they weren't exactly sure what kind of yeast they had. Whatever yeast the brewer was using at that time period was the yeast that you would use, just like if you were baking bread. We're gonna keep that at 70 or 75 degrees. We wanna cover our vessel up as well as we can, but still let it breathe. And we will start to see that yeast work after 12 hours. It'll probably float to the top. That's good. That's the yeast working. It's eating up the sugars inside of our beer. It's working, and it's starting to make carbon dioxide, and it's starting to make a little bit of alcohol. At this point, we can actually start to drink this green beer. We can strain off that yeast. Now in this recipe, it says to bottle it. Now they say put a raisin or a little bit of sugar in there. That's priming the bottle. That's making it so the yeast can still work and kind of seal it up, and it will start to carbonate in that bottle. So they made special bottles in the 18th century that could hold the pressure. So yeah, sometimes they had carbonated beer. Many people would at this point just go ahead and drink it. This batch would probably be finished up in a couple of days, maybe a week, and you would make a brand new batch. Now, this is a simple beer. It's a table beer, it's a small beer, it's a beer drink by everyone. It is not meant to be an expensive beer that would stay in a bottle for 6 months. Now, some people might not even call this beer because it doesn't have hops. There are some recipes for this type of molasses beer that do have some hops in it, but generally the hops is just there for a bittering flavor, not there because of its preservation technique. So true beer has hops in it, and the hops is there to help preserve that beer, to keep it from going bad with bacteria. So this might not be perfectly a beer, maybe more closely related to cider than to beer, but let's try it out. It's got a good flavor. There's some sweetness to it because the yeast hasn't eaten up all those sugars. So it's very, very mildly alcoholic, but you can hardly detect it at all. There's a little bit of that ginger there, mostly the molasses flavor. And if we don't use blackstrap, which is a little too bitter for this kind of thing, just a standard baking molasses, make sure it's unsulfured. It makes a nice little table beer. This is the working man's beer.